The front door tore open as the first rumblings of thunder burst through the early evening air. I could barely say hello before my mom threw an arm around my shoulders and tugged me inside. "Bert, Hallie's finally home." I laughed as she pulled my bag from my hand and started fussing over me, brushing my hair back, squeezing my cheeks together. It was a habit that I had always hoped she would grow out of as I reached adolescence. But after 7 long months away, I had to admit that it made me feel right back at home. "Mom, stop, I'm fine," I insisted half-heartedly. "You're late." She stuck one of those fingers right in my face and wagged it around. "Dinner's been done for half an hour." Her eyes flickered to the front window, where the first droplets of rain had begun to spit from the sky. "And it's about to storm." "Of course it is." I shook my head and chuckled. It was a running joke in our family at this point. Every year on my birthday, it rained, without fail. For as long as I can remember, birthdays were marked by gathering around our dining room table, eating cake and opening presents, all while watching the world drown from out the side window. Thankfully, birthdays were always family events. There were always time for friends, my parents had told me, but I only had so much time left to spend with them. "Let me put my stuff away, I'll be down in a second," I said, starting up the stairs. With each step, my head throbbed like an overinflated balloon. My early birthday celebration the night before had been a success, but the hangover left in its wake was very wicked. My bedroom sat at the end of the hallway, untouched since I had left for college in the fall. It was a strange little time capsule of old friends and faded memories that by now felt like another lifetime. I smiled and tossed my backpack on the bed. Something delicious tickled at my nose as I made my way back downstairs and headed toward the dining room. My mom's famous jambalaya was another birthday tradition. It sounded like the perfect thing to settle my stomach and my nerves. My dad was already seated at the head of the table, a tumbler of scotch in hand that he had raised in a toast, as I rounded the corner. "And there she is," he boomed, his thick brown mustache bobbing over his lips for dramatic effect. "The prodigal daughter returns." "Oh, shut up." I laughed and headed over for a quick hug. Soon enough, we had settled in and all had an overflowing plate in front of us. They wasted no time before falling back into their familiar routine of grilling me on just about every subject they could think of. Grades, friends, my new part-time job. My parents have always been involved, to say the least. It was another one of those things that I'd only been able to start appreciating with time. "How's that dorm life?" my dad asked as my mom hopped up to start scooping dessert. "Is that roommate of yours still stealing your clothes?" That's actually something I wanted to talk to you guys about." My stomach sank to the floor and blood rushed my cheeks. "What's that?" asked my mom. "Well, you guys know I had such bad luck this year with her. It really interrupted my studies," I stressed. "You didn't tell us that." "Well, it did, so that's why me and Brian decided next semester that we're going to move in together." The silence that fell was bitterly cold. It froze both of my parents in place, mouth agape, waiting for me to say the punchline. Seconds ticked by before, all at once, they exploded back to life. "Like hell you are," said my dad. "You've got to be kidding me," said my mom. "Dad, You're 19 years old, Hallie. You're way too young to be shacking up with some loser." "Dad, I'm an adult. You can't just..." "Oh, are you adult enough to pay for school on your own?" We went back and forth for a while, voices steadily rising as the cherry pie on our plates got cold and thunder shook the windows. I had known they wouldn't approve, but this was worse than I had ever imagined. Mom stayed quiet, caught between us like a hostage negotiator, begging with her eyes for us to calm down. "Go ahead then," I shot up from my chair, sending it crashing to the floor behind me as I slammed my hand on the polished tabletop. "Cut me off. I'll drop out and wait tables for the rest of my life. Either way, I'm moving in with him. End of story." "Hallie, sit your butt down." His shouting grew distant as I turned and stormed back down the hall and up the stairs, eventually slamming my bedroom door behind me. It was juvenile perhaps, but it still felt good to make the frame quake behind me as I took to pacing the room. Frustration bubbled under my skin, like a shaken soda bottle ready to burst. How many fights had ended this very same way? How many times did my parents put their foot down when I tried to establish the barest hint of independence? Too many to count. I was sure Mom was rubbing Dad's back by then, assuring him that I would come to my senses. He wouldn't apologize, he never did. Instead, he would wait for me to sulk back with my tail between my legs, ready to apologize and give in to whatever he decided was right for me. Well, screw that. I slung my backpack back over my shoulder and grabbed my keys. I would drive 15 more hours if it meant that I didn't have to look at his smug face waiting for me to cow. I heard their voices muttering from the dining room as I swung the front door open. The mossy smell of fresh rain hit me like a brick, while the chilled breeze washed down my lungs like a glass of ice water. "Hallie!" My mother screamed from the other room. Pulling the hood of my jacket snugly over my head, I darted off the porch. A wave of pain exploded in my body, so intense that my vision went black for a moment, so consuming I couldn't tell right away where it had come from. Before I knew it, I was being lurched backward by something wrapped tightly around my neck. I hit the porch with a thud. The pressure eased. My mother knelt over me, eyes wide as dinner plates. "Oh God," she whispered. The pain, it was still there, burning, spreading. It prickled along my cheek and my hands. I moaned, a low and keening noise that I almost didn't recognize as my own. And then I lifted my hand up in front of my face. A sob tore from my lips as I caught sight of it. It was like acid had been splashed across my skin. Gelatinous clumps of flesh had melted away, dripping down my wrist and coagulating on the sleeve of my hoodie. It was still going, a bubbling liquid eating away everything in its path. Even worse was what lay underneath it. Instead of the pearly white bones I might expect jutting up from the mess of ruined flesh, something else sat there instead. There were fingers, sure. My fingers, given how they clenched and moved in turn with the waves of pain that coursed through me. But they were as black as the night around us, made of hundreds of delicate intertwining bones that reminded me of birds' legs. They joined at the top into a vicious point. A scream bubbled up in the back of my throat, trapped there as tear-streaked eyes darted to my mother's worried face. She barely glanced at the misshapen hand, though did reach down to give my covered shoulder a comforting squeeze. My eyes turned to find my father shaking in the doorway. "Bert," she gasped, raising her free hand to cover her trembling lips. "They're going to find her." My dad sprung into action, our argument from moments before a long-forgotten memory. He hooked his arms under my shoulders and dragged me back inside. I hung limp like a rag doll, tears finally breaking through the barrier of shock and disorientation that had held them at bay. My mother slammed the door shut behind us, clicking the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place. "I'll get the bags," she announced. My father gave one quick, grim nod. "I'll get the car ready." "What's happening?" I groaned from the floor, cradling my ruined hand in the other. Some patches of flesh had burned away on it as well, but altogether it was in much better shape. It still looked like mine. It still looked human. I could even still see the scar from 7th grade, where Preston had stabbed me with a pencil. "We don't have time, sweetie," he said. "We have to move." He disappeared down the hallway and I heard the door to the garage crash open. I was left alone to hiccup and cry on the foyer floor until I had finally calmed enough to pull my unsteady feet back underneath me. My face still burned. I staggered into the living room where an oversized ornate mirror hung behind the couch. Everything in my body screamed that this was a horrible idea, that I didn't want to know, but I had to see. I just had to. Even still, I gasped. Spots of disintegration were speckled across my face. The tip of my nose was gone. My left cheek was hollowed out like a pumpkin. Underneath sat those same spindly, paper-thin bones. Millions of them. In the overhead light, they had an eerie, incandescent glow. But wait, were they moving? Thunder ripped through the sky outside. My body shook right along with the frame of the house. Realization struck just as lightning lit the front yard. The spots of my body that were injured were the areas uncovered by my jacket or my clothes. My exposed skin. It was where the rain had touched me. No, that made no sense. I had been out in the rain plenty of times in my life. I had walked home in it after school. Came home drenched one night after sneaking out with my friends. In fact, I was quite fond of the rain, despite the fact that it had always seemed to unsettle my mom. It made no sense. Another crashing sound thudded through the house, almost mistaken for another round of thunder. The storm was right on top of us now, roaring and ripping all around, but no clap of lightning followed. Seconds later, bang! I jumped back, glancing toward the ceiling. Upstairs, my mother raced back and forth. Drawers squeaked open and closed. But no, that wasn't it. "Dad!" I called in a hushed tone down the hall. There wasn't an answer. I couldn't hear him past the hum of the storm. Movement caught my eye in the mirror. I searched for it once, twice. Nothing. A car drove by on the street outside, headlights cutting through the inky darkness of the street. There, palms outstretched down the front window, stood a massive shadow. I spun around. The light quickly flickered away, bathing it once more in darkness. But now that my eyes had found it, I couldn't possibly look away. It wasn't a shadow at all, just a mess of dark, delicate bones. Its eyes glinted beyond the glass, a deep, intoxicating violet. As it watched me, something on its face stretched wide. More darkness lingered in its open mouth, but I could tell it was smiling. I screamed, all the horror that had welled up inside me reaching a shrill, piercing crescendo. My father barreled around the corner, but jerked to a stop when he saw the creature out the window. Its long, spindly fingers curled into a fist and beat against the glass. "She's ours," my father shouted. "Leave us alone." He wrapped an arm around my waist and pulled me back into the foyer. My mother was just descending the stairs, a bag in hand. The glass above the front window exploded inward, showering us in crystalline shards. All three of us darted for the back door. Adrenaline dulled the pain in my hand to a distant ache. My parents' SUV was already running, the back seat piled high with totes and bags previously tucked away in the garage. I had never asked what my dad had kept stored out there, why the garage was the only room in the house perpetually cluttered. I hopped in the back seat while my parents climbed in the front. I huffed as my father adjusted the rearview. I could see his veins bulging in his arm. My mom's tear-stricken face glancing behind us. "Now, Bert." Her tone was solemn, resigned. My father clicked the garage door opener and shifted into reverse. The door hummed and then kicked to life, groaning as it inched up off the ground. The sound of rain still dancing along the roof above us. I turned in my seat to stare out the back window. We all held our breath. The door was about 3 feet high when the first dark figure wrapped its hands around its base and shoved upwards. Metal squealed against metal as it was pushed further up into the ceiling. My hands darted to my ears, and then I caught sight of my own blackened fingers as they fell back down to my side. Another figure darted in, skittering against the cement, jumping up to rest on our bumper. Behind it was a third, this one more cautious, peeking in under the door and smiling its predatory grin. "Now!" my mom shouted. My dad slammed in the gas and the Ford flew backward. The door hadn't fully ascended. The two creatures still back there jumped to either side. The roof of the vehicle scraped the aluminum door, sticking for a few long, painful seconds before we burst free into the night air. The last creature clung on for dear life, hands digging into the side of the vehicle, feet slipping against the now slick bumper. Its black teeth gnashed against the glass. Its purple eyes were wide, hysterical. It looked pained, terrified, sad. My dad hardly slowed as we pulled out onto the street and kicked it in drive, even as the tires screamed underneath us. As we lurched forward, it struggled against the vehicle, eventually losing its grip and tumbling away. I watched it hit the wet cement behind us with a thud. The others weren't far behind. Both stopped to pull it back up to its feet. We ripped through our quiet suburban neighborhood, twisting and turning until we had reached the exit for the highway. The creatures faded behind us, yet still I found myself staring out into the pouring rain, hands stinging in my lap. Finally, I was pulled from my daze by the jarring flash of headlights behind us. I turned back around to my parents. "Mom," I said. "Dad, what's going on?" They exchanged a long glance. My mom shook as she reached out to turn down the radio. I hadn't even noticed it humming in the background. "We should have told you, Hallie," she whispered, shaking her head. "We were foolish to think we were foolish to wait so long." I stared down at my torn hand. The same delicate, alien black bones of the creatures that had attacked us. Was I? "You shouldn't have tried to leave, sweetie," added my dad. I never heard him sound so small, so helpless. The disappointment in his tone was nothing like his rage-fueled rants of disapproval, but something far more visceral. "Now I don't know if we can protect you." "Don't say that," my mother snapped. I leaned back into the plush gray seat, exhaustion sinking me down into the headrest. I caught a glance at myself in the rearview. My burned, speckled face looked pale, sickly. The blue of my eyes looked darker, deeper. "Protect me from what?" I asked. A sob shook my mother's chest. She turned toward the window and buried her face in her hands. My dad's eyes rose to meet my own in the mirror, brows hanging over them like thick branches bowing in the wind. Something deep in my gut already knew the answer, but even still, I needed to hear him say it. I needed to know. "From your family." We drove for hours in silence, my father staring silently out into the road, and my mother sniffling and hiccuping next to him. After the adrenaline of our escape had wore off, I curled up in the back row of seats and did my best to let my mind drift off into a welcome oblivion. The sting in my hand had worn off several miles out of town. When I realized that the pain was gone, I lifted it to my face to inspect it further. My human fingertips brushed against the melted skin, and it flaked away underneath like a bad sunburn. I grabbed a bit of it and tugged. It pulled away in a long, gooey string that stuck to the seat underneath me. "Don't do that," my mother snapped. I hadn't even noticed her looking. It all started shortly after they were married, my father had said. back when they had just begun to dream of the wonderful little family that they would have together. "I've heard this story 1,000 times," I had told him, huffing in frustration. "You and Mom wanted a dozen kids at least, but no matter what, it never seemed to happen. You nearly gave up, but the week after Mom's doctor told you that it was hopeless, she got pregnant with me." "No," he had said. "We never told you she got pregnant." I quieted down and let him continue. "We had tried everything at that point. Doctors, of course, but more than that. Faith healers, shamans, wishing on shooting stars. It seemed like every culture around the world had their little spells and charms to help with fertility. But at the end of the day, most of them were full of crap. Until one wasn't," my mom whispered. "It was the strangest thing. Back before we had moved here, we lived in this tiny little town called St. James. Down the block from our apartment was a widow, Mrs. Danby. She was a strange woman, kept to herself. Every single window to her house was covered in blackout curtains. I only ever saw her sitting on her porch when I left for the hospital before the sun rose, or got home in the wee hours of the morning. She always waved, but she never said hello." "We never told her anything," my mom interjected. "Like you said, we never talked to her. I hadn't told her about my issues with getting pregnant. I hadn't told anyone, not even Grandma or Grandpa. I just felt so useless." "Margaret." My dad's voice softened. He reached out to squeeze her leg. "You didn't do anything wrong." "But one day," she continued, "the old woman showed up at the door. Dad was at work and the sun was still high in the sky. In her arms was a dark purple blanket wrapped in a tight bundle. Whatever was inside was moving, squirming. I swallowed down the lump, expanding in my throat. "It was me?" I asked. She let out a long, shaking breath. "Yes, it was you." Road signs had flickered past the windows at that point, announcing our departure from town. Rain continued to beat heavily against the windows, blown from wind almost as chilly as the silence between us. My mother cleared her throat and continued. "She said she had known of our struggles, how badly we wanted a family. That while she couldn't make our dreams come true, she could give us one, just one, a child of her own." I was terrified. I thought that she had gone off her rocker for good. I thought she had kidnapped a baby or something. But I was sort of mesmerized by her too. I looked down at the bundle, and even though I couldn't see anything inside, I could just feel it, you know. That child, that you were ours. "I don't understand," I said, only for my father to snap back at me. "Just let your mother finish." "I invited her inside," she continued, "and she locked the door behind her. She ushered me back into the bedroom like she had been there before, like she knew exactly where it was. She told me to keep quiet, to listen, or for as long as I had lived I'd never hear the laughter of a child. I didn't even question it. I just believed her." She pulled back the blanket and she wavered, gripping hard at the center console. I didn't know what I was seeing. It was tiny and black as coal. I thought it was something dead. And then it started to coo. She set it down on the bed and it stretched its little arms, wiggled its toes. Despite how strange it looked, it was clearly a baby. She took my hand in hers, squeezed it like a vice. It was ours now, she had told me. Ours forever, as long as we protected it, as long as we had loved it. I promised her we would, that it was all I ever wanted. When I looked back, its black little bones were gone, covered in soft, pale flesh. red round cheeks. "We do love you," my father added. Guilt swam in his voice like a koi fish. "You know that, right?" She squeezed my hand tighter until I looked back over at her. Tears were streaming down my face at that point, but her eyes were hard as steel. She leaned in close. Her breath smelled like menthol and incense. "There was one rule we couldn't break if we truly wanted this child to be ours," she said. "Once a year, on the anniversary of that day, it would rain. It would rain all day and all night, until the ground flooded and the trees fell. And no matter what, we could never let that particular rain touch her skin. If we did, the illusion would be gone. And the creatures that she came from," my father finished, "would find her." A million questions filled my head, but as soon as each occurred, they drifted back out like a wave receding from the shore. It was too much for my mind to grasp. Somewhere along the line, exhaustion took me, and I drifted off into a fitful sleep. Sometime later, I started back awake, only to find the air filled with my mother's soft snores. My dad still stared vigilantly ahead of us. I couldn't recognize where we were. As I searched the dark night for a clue, I swore I could see shadows flickering along the tree line in the distance. "Dad," I muttered, pushing myself up from the seat with my skeletal hand. The pain had all but vanished. It felt stronger somehow, vibrant, like a current of energy zipped up and down the length of my fingers. "Where are we going?" For a moment, I wasn't sure if he would answer me, too lost in his own grim thoughts and all the encompassing darkness ahead. Finally, he sighed, glancing back at me through the rearview mirror. "We're going to St. Jane's, Hallie. We're going to get some answers." The town sat several miles off of the highway, a small decrepit place one could easily pass through without realizing it even existed. The gas station on its outskirts was the only lit building that I saw. Otherwise, the dim glow of street lamps in the distance looked more like dying stars hanging close to Earth, ready to fall. My mom started to wake as we pulled to a stop. In a flash, she had taken in our surroundings and I could see the apprehension well up in her puffy cheeks. "Are you sure she's still here, Bert?" My father snorted. "Where else will the old hag go?" I stayed quiet in the back seat, ducked down with my hood pulled tightly around my head. I couldn't imagine how the woman was still alive, if she had already been old when I was a baby. My father seemed confident though. What room did I have to argue? My mom darted off to use the restroom, and outside the opposite door my dad fiddled with the gas cap. The storm had finally calmed into a half-hearted drizzle around us, bathing the cement in a glossy, dazzling sheen. They knew I was close, that I was coming home. They didn't have to search for me any longer. Soon, my parents packed back into the car. Even from behind them, I could practically feel them buzzing with trepidation, feel the hair on the back of their arms rising from the chill of the air. Large round drops of water pooled on their raincoats, so close I could reach out and touch it. The car jerked into motion and we pulled back onto the road. The town ahead inched closer as my dad stepped on the gas. For most of the trip, I had been tired and dazed in the back seat, but now I sat ramrod straight, attention held rapidly by those lights in the distance. The tingling in my veins turned into a full-on itch. It was all I could do to keep it at bay. Out of nowhere, I lurched forward, forehead colliding with the back of the driver's seat before the suddenly tightened seatbelt made me gag from its pressure. I lifted both hands up to protect my face, to try in vain to push myself back up. The car was spinning, I realized, skating on the wet cement as if it were a roller rink, the tail end skidding to the left. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," my mother chanted like a prayer. and then the impact hit and quieted all of us. Seconds crawled by like ants through molasses. I raised my clawed hand to my head and retracted it, to find fresh, flowing blood. The window next to me was cracked, one large round point of impact that spiderwebbed out in delicate patterns throughout the entirety of the pane. To my right, the car was crumpled like an old candy wrapper, folded around a massive tree trunk. My mother was groaning, pawing at her right elbow. My father was slumped down in his seat. I leaned forward to peer over the center console. The headlights still illuminated the murky night ahead. 4 lanky shadow figures stood vigilantly in the distance, their bodies swaying and pulsing with unspent energy. Then a bang. I jumped as something collided with the side of the car. A hand, I realized, pounding against the glass of my father's window. A hand that was black as night, composed of delicate, spindly bones and a 19-year vendetta. Something landed on top of the car and another hand pounded against the windshield. Neither of my parents had come to yet. My mind raced, trying to remember where my father had stashed the gun, turning over the possibility of us getting the car moving again even if we tried. Every train of thought only led back to one cold, hard reality. I couldn't protect them. Not here, not like this. In the distance, the others began to approach. I snatched my hoodie back over my head and pulled the strings to tighten it as far as it would go. My hands wrapped around the door handle. In front of me, small pieces of glass chipped away from the rest of the pane on the driver's window and flew toward my father's face. I took a deep, slow breath to steady myself, and then I shoved my door open. In seconds, I was darting away, wincing as the dripping rain met my skin and sent short sizzles of pain searing through me. I shoved my hands in my pockets, which threw me off balance but at least kept the worst of it at bay, as I made it 1 yard away, and then 2. On the road, there were more of them. One was collapsed on the ground, its long skeletal leg jutting off at a severe sort of angle, with 2 more trying to pull it to its feet. From behind me, a screech filled the air, alerting the others to my presence. I swerved to avoid them, and headed for the trees in the distance. I let out a pained cry as I broke through the forest line. My clothes were growing heavy with the weight of the water soaking into them, shaken off of the overhanging leaves. As it pressed against my skin, the brief bursts of pain turned into a full-on blaze. It was as if boiling water or acid had seeped into my hoodie and jeans and clung like static against my skin. The pain quickly got the better of me, leaving me staggering, jerking my hands out of my pockets just in time to brace against a tree as I started to lose my balance. Its bark bit at my hands, rubbing away the delicate, false skin that clung to it. My vision swayed, nausea bubbling in my stomach like a fizzy drink. I clawed desperately at the base of my jacket and the tank top underneath, anything to make the burning stop. I pulled them up and over my head, crying as my skin clung to them, sloughing off my bones like a layer of dried glue. I glanced down at my body. I couldn't help it. Somehow, I still expected to see red, pulsing organs and pearly, white ribs, but there was nothing of the sort. Only midnight dark bones, hard and protective like an exoskeleton. I fumbled next with my jeans, hands shaking in anticipation of the pain that would follow. Already, the searing sensation from my torso had turned into a dull ache that I longed for across the rest of my body, skin be damned. Everything around me tilted and shivered, but as I kicked off my shoes and shoved the denim down over my ankles, movement from up ahead caught my eye. I stumbled out of my pants and fell backward, hitting the wet grass with a thud. Up ahead of me was one of them, standing regally against the trees. Another emerged from the shadows, and then another. I twisted to look behind them. 3 more were already there. "Don't hurt them," I begged. My own voice was unfamiliar to me, filled with gravel. "Please don't hurt them. I'll do anything Why would we hurt them, dear?" A voice spoke from somewhere ahead of me. I looked back and forth between the creatures, trying to make sense of where those sweet, matronly words had originated from. From behind one of the trees, another figure appeared, short and stooped, shuffling carefully over the uneven ground. Her gray hair stood out like a beacon in the dark night, yet the trees above cast ghastly shadows into the deep-set wrinkles of her face. Her grin was sinister, yet nothing else in her posture suggested a threat. The creatures, my family, parted to let her through. "All they want is for you to come home." One of the creatures approached me. It was slow, hesitant in its movements. It reached a tentative hand out to brush against my cheek. I flinched, but forced my gaze up regardless to meet its violet eyes. I could swear that I saw tears welling up in the corners. Two others moved forward, offering their hands to help me to my feet. Together, we stumbled after Miss Danby as she turned and headed deeper into the forest. Behind me, the injured creature was helped along by the others, and we kept a slow, steady pace with one another. In the distance, I could hear my father screaming my name. The forest was deeper and darker than I would have imagined, growing thick around me with each treacherous step. My feet caught in the underbrush, but for every trip and stumble the creature stood patiently by my side as I recovered. Up ahead of us, Miss Danby moved through the trees with startling ease, despite her advanced age. Her and her companions nearly blended in with the wilderness, an extension of the gnarled bark and twisting branches around us. The thought comforted me, and then instantly filled me with unease as I realized how preposterous that was. Family or not, I didn't belong here. The farther we went, the more that I had to keep reminding myself. I'm not sure how long or how far we walked before the old witch finally came to a stop. I could barely make out a line of stones in the ground before her, jutting off in either direction and disappearing into the thick foliage. The creatures that had accompanied her continued onward, stepping over the rocks and flickering out of view. The group with the injured member soon followed. I blinked and then squinted against the darkness. They hadn't just tucked themselves away in the shadows. They had disappeared entirely, as if the forest itself had sucked them back in. My gaze dropped back down to the stones for a moment, before rising to see Miss Dansby's grinning face. "I found them by accident," she explained, gesturing toward the towering trees behind her. "Many years ago, I lost my husband and daughter in a car crash. Overnight, I was left all alone. I took to wandering in the forest. I would walk for hours on end, listening to the wind and the birds, imagining that I heard their voices whispering just under the surface. I was probably mad with grief, but it was like I knew if I just kept walking, I might find them again." "But you didn't," I said, taking a step closer to her. I understood the pull my mother felt to this strange, mesmerizing woman. Even though she spoke in a hushed, intimate volume, each word seemed polished, grand, rolling off her tongue with a conspiratory flourish. "Of course not," she huffed. "They were dead." It was her turn to move forward, floating past me to stop in front of the towering monster to my right. The one who had brushed my cheek looked at me with so much longing that it made my stomach twist. The old woman smiled at it and reached out to clutch its hand, giving it a small, loving squeeze. But I did find them. "What are they?" Finally, I felt something stirring within me, a hint of dismay that I should have been feeling all along. "You mean," she corrected, dropping the creature's hand to point a finger in my direction. "What are you?" My gaze dropped to the front of my body, the twisted, black bones that had been hiding just below the surface. There were still spots of flesh speckled along my legs and torso, but even that was starting to curl around the edges and flake away. Soon, there would be none left at all. "They don't have a name," she continued. "At least not one that humans would understand. They're simply a part of the forest, a part of nature. They always have been. They live here, tucked away safely behind their barrier." The stones, I realized, they kept them hidden from the world. "They can't leave unless it's raining," I said, voice breathless. Miss Danby nodded, pleased with my assessment. "No, they cannot." That twisting feeling in my stomach became a full-on lurch. Visions of my life at home flashing before my eyes as if on a projector screen. My dorm room, messy and cramped, but filled with laughter and all-nighters. A year's worth of independence. Brian with his boyish smile and crooked front tooth. On our third date, he had asked before he had kissed me, and he brushed the hair out of my face. Mom and Dad, all of our many battles contrasting against how fiercely they loved me, how proud they were of every accomplishment. "I can't leave," I continued. "Not once I'm past the stones." Her grin faltered, though I suspected that was only for my benefit. Despite her compelling performance, empathy wasn't a look that she wore well. "No," she confirmed. "You cannot." "Why?" I snapped, stumbling backward, away from them. The two creatures to my left moved toward me, tension rippling through their taut bodies. "Why do I have to go back?" "It's your home," she answered calmly, despite the hint of hysteria escalating in my voice. "It's where you belong." "Then why did you take me away? Why did you give me to my parents in the first place?" She sighed, a wrinkled hand raising a rest on one of their shoulders. "They're a powerful species. I'm sure you've seen evidence of that. Unlike any other being on this earth. Unfortunately, they're ill-equipped to take care of their young. In the past, they lived alongside humans. They had an understanding with the local tribes in the area. The humans raised their young, and they offered them protection. When I found them, there were only a handful left. You tricked my parents. You preyed on their desire for a child. That's sick." My heart quivered like a rabbit in my chest. The creatures sensed my panic. One opened its mouth and let out a garbled roar. It seemed pleading, pained. Pity cooled the rising tide of my anger. At least until Miss Danby opened her mouth again. "Normally, they can't keep them out of the rain so long. Your family did an admirable job with you." My fist curled at my side. I could feel the newfound power that resided within them. It pulsed, begging to be released. I imagined grabbing the old widow by the collar and darting off into the trees, sinking my teeth into her skin. Bang! The noises of the forest came to an unsettling halt, as these sounds echoed off the tall trees surrounding us. I looked between the creatures in confusion, before my gaze fell on Miss Danby. Her eyes were wide, panicked. Looking down, a gaping hole in her chest leaked blood down her torso. Behind her, my father trained his gun on one of the monsters. In a flash, they turned to him, screeching. One pounced, pinning him to the ground. The other knelt beside Miss Danby, warbling as it tried to cover her wound. The shock rooted me in place, at least until one of them emerged from the stone barrier, and then another. They darted off to join the battle. "Dad!" he screamed as claws dug into his shoulder, sinking through them like warm butter. In a flash, the long black arm jerked back, pulling his shoulder along with it. Red exploded from the wound. Sinew stretched and did its best to hold on, until my father's arm was separated completely. I stumbled forward in a daze. "Stop," I begged them. "Please stop." The creature at Miss Danby's side rose to face me. I cowered as it stepped closer, the warmth of tears stinging my bony cheeks. "Don't let them kill him. I'll come with you. I'll do anything." It tilted its head. Despite the fact they didn't speak, I knew intrinsically that it could understand me. If only I could say the same about it. It glanced back at my father, now surrounded by 4 of them. There was so much blood. Too much. I couldn't tell what they had done to him. His screams had grown quiet, weak. A sob shook my shoulders. The creature moved like a flash of lightning bursting through the sky. It wrapped its willowy arms around me, scooping me up against its chest. "No," I gasped, beating my fists against it. "Put me down." It turned and darted off into the forest, away from the rocks. It moved quickly, weaving with expert precision through trees and over stones. If the others noticed, if the others followed, we had enough of a head start to outrun them. Rain still leaked out from the sky above, but would soon end. The creatures wouldn't be able to leave. Not for me, not for another year. When we emerged out into the darkened street, I found my mother sitting on the dented hood of the car. It was running somehow, pulled back and away from the trunk that it had slammed into. She had her hand raised to her mouth, chewing anxiously at her nails, her eyes strained red. The creature lowered me to the ground and my mother gasped as she noticed me. She rushed towards us, only to falter as she got close enough to see the creature up close. I covered the distance instead, stooping to throw my arms around her neck. "Your father," she said. "Is he?" "Gone," I mumbled, sniffling. "He's gone." She nodded and stepped back from me. "Get in the car, Hallie." I stepped forward and then paused. The creature stayed put behind me, watching wearily as its daughter left it for the second time, this time on its own volition. I met its purple eyes, glossy and filled with grief. I knew that it wouldn't be back to chase me down in the coming years. The same couldn't be said for the others. Whatever this creature was, whatever I was, it loved me. "Come with us," I said. I could hear my human mother sucking in a startled breath behind me. She didn't argue though, didn't question it. She, of course, loved me too. The creature hesitated, glancing back at the forest that was its home, taking in the chirps and warbles and the chilly, refreshing breeze. This was where it belonged, and we both knew it. That's what made it so surprising when it stepped forward toward the car. We packed into the back seat, huddling together as my mom pulled back onto the highway. The rain had slowed into an unenthusiastic drizzle. A purple-pink sunrise peeked over the skyline. I smiled at the creature next to me and reached out to grab its hand. My family was going home.